The sun barely peeked over the horizon as Brutus, a German shepherd with a coat as dark as night, stood at attention beside his handler, Ryan Thompson. The air was thick with tension, and the desert heat was already starting to build, promising another scorching day in Afghanistan. Brutus's ears were perked up, his brown eyes alert and scanning the terrain ahead. He was more than just a dog, he was a highly trained member of the US Army's K-9 unit, and today was just another day on the job for him. Ryan, a young soldier in his mid-20s with sandy blonde hair and determined blue eyes, knelt beside Brutus, double-checking the dog's protective vest. His hands moved with practiced ease, making sure every strap was secure. "Ready for another day at the office, buddy?" Ryan murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. Brutus responded with a soft whine, his tail wagging once before settling back into his professional demeanor. The bond between Brutus and Ryan was something special, forged through countless missions and training exercises. They had been partners for 3 years now, and in that time, they had become more than just a team, they were family. Ryan trusted Brutus with his life, and the feeling was mutual. In the chaos of war, they were each other's constant, a reminder of home and hope in a place where both could be hard to find. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, Ryan's unit began to move out. Their mission today was to sweep an area suspected of containing improvised explosive devices, IEDs. It was dangerous work, but it was crucial for the safety of both military personnel and local civilians. Brutus led the way, his nose close to the ground, sniffing for the telltale scents of explosives. The team moved slowly through the rocky terrain, every step calculated and careful. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the crunch of boots on gravel and the occasional distant sound of a helicopter. Ryan kept his eyes on Brutus, watching for any change in the dog's behavior that might signal danger. Hours passed, and the heat became almost unbearable. Ryan's uniform was soaked with sweat, and he could see Brutus panting heavily. But neither of them faltered in their duty. They had cleared most of the designated area without incident, and a sense of cautious optimism began to spread through the unit. That's when everything changed. The first sign of trouble was a barely perceptible change in Brutus's posture. His ears flattened slightly, and his tail, which had been held high, dropped a fraction. Ryan noticed immediately and signaled for the unit to halt. Years of training and experience had taught him to trust Brutus's instincts without question. Suddenly, the air was filled with the deafening sound of gunfire. Hidden insurgents had sprung an ambush, catching the unit in a deadly crossfire. Ryan's training kicked in instantly. He dropped to the ground, returning fire while simultaneously trying to keep an eye on Brutus. "Take cover," Ryan shouted to his team, his voice barely audible over the chaos. Soldiers scrambled for whatever protection they could find, the rocky terrain offering little in the way of shelter. In the midst of the firefight, Brutus remained focused on his primary mission. Despite the bullets whizzing past, he continued to search for IEDs, knowing that in the panic of the ambush, his team might inadvertently stumble into hidden explosives. Ryan watched in awe as Brutus worked, the dog's bravery a stark reminder of why these animals were so valuable in combat situations. But his admiration was cut short as he spotted movement to his left. An insurgent had managed to flank their position and was taking aim at one of Ryan's teammates. Without hesitation, Ryan sprang into action. He sprinted towards his fellow soldier, tackling him just as the insurgent opened fire. They hit the ground hard, the breath knocked out of both of them, but they were alive. As Ryan struggled to his feet, ready to return fire, the world around him exploded. An IED, hidden just beneath the surface, detonated with a thunderous roar. The force of the blast threw Ryan several feet, and for a moment, everything went black. When Ryan came to, the world was a blur of smoke and noise. His ears were ringing, and every part of his body ached. He tried to move but found himself pinned down by debris. Panic began to set in as he realized he couldn't feel his legs. Through the haze of pain and confusion, Ryan heard a familiar bark. Brutus had somehow found him in the chaos. The loyal dog was there, standing over Ryan, protecting him from further harm. Despite his own injuries, a deep gash visible on his side, Brutus remained vigilant, his teeth bared at any potential threat. The firefight continued around them, but Brutus didn't budge. He stood his ground, a furry shield between Ryan and danger. In that moment, as Ryan drifted in and out of consciousness, he was overwhelmed by the depth of Brutus's loyalty. This wasn't just a trained response, it was love in its purest form. Time seemed to stretch endlessly as Ryan lay there, Brutus standing guard. He could hear shouts in the distance, the sounds of his team regrouping and fighting back. But for Ryan, the world had narrowed to just him and Brutus. He reached out a shaky hand, and Brutus nuzzled it gently, offering comfort even in the midst of battle. Finally, after what felt like hours but was likely only minutes, help arrived. Ryan's teammates had managed to push back the insurgents and were now working on evacuating the wounded. As they approached, Brutus let out a series of sharp barks, alerting them to Ryan's location. The extraction was a blur for Ryan. He remembered being carefully lifted onto a stretcher, the pain in his body almost unbearable. But through it all, Brutus was there, limping alongside the stretcher, refusing to leave Ryan's side even as the medics worked to stabilize him. As they loaded Ryan into the medevac helicopter, one of the medics tried to hold Brutus back. But Ryan, summoning what little strength he had left, managed to croak out, "He comes with me." The tone in his voice left no room for argument, and Brutus was allowed to join Ryan in the helicopter. During the flight back to base, as the medical team worked frantically to keep Ryan stable, Brutus lay at his feet, his eyes never leaving his partner's face. Despite his own injuries, the dog's focus was entirely on Ryan, as if willing him to stay alive through sheer force of devotion. Back at the base hospital, Ryan was rushed into emergency surgery. Brutus, after receiving treatment for his own wounds, waited outside the operating room, refusing food or rest. Hours passed, and finally, a tired-looking doctor emerged. "He's going to make it," the doctor announced to the group of soldiers who had gathered. A collective sigh of relief went through the crowd. Brutus, as if understanding the news, let out a soft whine. When Ryan was finally moved to a recovery room, Brutus was allowed to see him. The dog approached the bed cautiously, sniffing at Ryan's hand. Ryan, still groggy from the anesthesia, managed to open his eyes. "Hey, buddy," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "You saved me." Brutus responded by gently laying his head on the bed next to Ryan's hand. It was a moment of quiet reunion, a reaffirmation of the bond that had brought them through hell together. As Ryan began the long process of recovery, Brutus remained a constant presence. The dog stayed by his bed, only leaving when forced to by the medical staff for his own care. Ryan's road to healing would be long and difficult, his injuries were severe, and there was talk of medical discharge, but having Brutus there made it bearable. In the weeks that followed, as Ryan slowly regained his strength, the story of Brutus's bravery spread throughout the base. The dog was hailed as a hero, and there was even talk of a commendation. But for Brutus, the only reward that mattered was being able to stay by Ryan's side. As Ryan's discharge date approached, he found himself facing an uncertain future. The injuries he had sustained meant that his military career was over, and the thought of civilian life was daunting. But every time doubt and fear threatened to overwhelm him, he would look at Brutus and find strength in the unwavering loyalty of his four-legged partner. On the day Ryan was finally released from the hospital, Brutus walked beside him, matching his slow, unsteady pace. As they stepped out into the sunlight, Ryan paused, taking in the moment. He looked down at Brutus, who gazed back up at him with trust and affection. "Well, buddy," Ryan said, his voice thick with emotion, "looks like our next mission is going to be a little different." Brutus responded with a gentle woof, as if to say he was ready for whatever came next, as long as they faced it together. As they walked towards the transport that would take them to their new life, Ryan realized that while the war had changed him in many ways, it had also given him something invaluable: a friendship that transcended words, a partnership forged in the crucible of combat. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he knew that with Brutus by his side, he could face them. The desert sun beat down on them as they boarded the plane that would take them home. It was the end of one chapter, but as Ryan settled into his seat with Brutus at his feet, he knew it was also the beginning of another. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear: their journey together was far from over. The plane touched down on American soil with a gentle thud, marking the end of Ryan and Brutus's tour in Afghanistan. As they disembarked, The Georgia heat hit them like a wall, a stark contrast to the dry desert air they'd left behind. Ryan, still unsteady on his feet, leaned heavily on his crutches, while Brutus padded faithfully beside him, ever watchful of his partner's movements. The homecoming was bittersweet. Ryan's family was there to greet him, his parents, Tom and Linda, and his younger sister, Sarah. There were tears, hugs, and a flurry of emotions as they reunited. Brutus, sensing the heightened emotions, stayed close to Ryan, his presence a calming influence amidst the chaos. "Welcome home, son," Tom said, his voice gruff with emotion as he carefully embraced Ryan. Linda couldn't stop touching her son's face, as if reassuring herself that he was really there. Sarah knelt down to greet Brutus, recognizing the dog's importance to her brother. "So this is the hero we've heard so much about," she said, scratching Brutus behind the ears. The dog's tail wagged, but his eyes never left Ryan. The drive home to their small town of Millbrook was filled with catch-up conversation and plans for the future. Ryan listened more than he spoke, the reality of his new situation slowly sinking in. Brutus sat in the back seat next to him, a warm, solid presence against his leg. The Thompson family home was a modest two-story house with a wide front porch and a big backyard, a slice of American suburban life that felt surreal after the harsh realities of war. As they pulled into the driveway, Ryan saw the Welcome Home banner strung across the garage and felt a lump form in his throat. The first few weeks were a whirlwind of medical appointments, physical therapy sessions, and well-meaning visitors. Ryan put on a brave face, smiling and thanking everyone for their support, but inside, he was struggling. The nightmares started almost immediately, vivid replays of the ambush, the explosion, the feeling of helplessness as he lay injured on the battlefield. Brutus, ever attuned to Ryan's needs, took to sleeping on the floor next to Ryan's bed. On the nights when Ryan would wake up in a cold sweat, gasping for air, Brutus would be there, nuzzling his hand, grounding him in the present. During the day, Ryan threw himself into his physical therapy, determined to regain his strength. Brutus accompanied him to every session, watching attentively as Ryan worked to rebuild his muscles and relearn basic movements. The doctors were impressed with Ryan's progress, but they were equally impressed with Brutus's dedication. "I've never seen a dog so in tune with their owner," Dr. Martinez, Ryan's physical therapist, commented one day. "He's better than any therapy assistant I've ever had." Ryan managed a small smile. "He's been through it all with me," document. "I don't know where I'd be without him." But as the weeks turned into months, the reality of Ryan's new life began to set in. The physical wounds were healing, but the invisible scars of war ran deep. Ryan found himself struggling with the simplest tasks. A trip to the grocery store would leave him anxious and overwhelmed, loud noises would send him into a panic, and he had trouble connecting with old friends who couldn't understand what he'd been through. Brutus remained his constant companion, a silent support system that asked for nothing in return. The dog seemed to instinctively know when Ryan needed space and when he needed comfort. On the bad days, when Ryan couldn't bring himself to get out of bed, Brutus would lie beside him, a warm, steady presence reminding him that he wasn't alone. Ryan's family watched with growing concern as he withdrew further into himself. They tried to help, but Ryan pushed them away, unable to articulate the turmoil he was experiencing. The once confident and outgoing young man had become a shadow of himself, haunted by memories he couldn't escape. One night, after a particularly bad day filled with flashbacks and anxiety attacks, Ryan found himself sitting on the back porch, staring out into the darkness. Brutus lay at his feet, his head resting on Ryan's knee. The weight of everything, the trauma, the loss of his military career, the feeling of being adrift in a world that no longer made sense, came crashing down on Ryan. "I don't know if I can do this, Brutus," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I don't know how to live in this world anymore." Brutus lifted his head, his brown eyes filled with an understanding that went beyond words. He nudged Ryan's hand, asking for nothing more than to be there with him in that moment of vulnerability. It was then that Ryan made a decision that would change both their lives forever. With tears streaming down his face, he realized that he couldn't give Brutus the life he deserved. The dog who had saved his life, who had been his rock through the darkest times, deserved better than an owner who could barely take care of himself. The next morning, Ryan approached his parents with his decision. "I need to surrender Brutus to a shelter," he said, his voice hollow. "He deserves a better life than I can give him right now." Linda and Tom were shocked. They tried to talk him out of it, offering to help care for Brutus, but Ryan was adamant. "He needs more than I can give him," he insisted. "He deserves a family who can give him the attention and care he needs." The drive to the local animal shelter was the hardest thing Ryan had ever done. Brutus sat in the passenger seat, sensing that something was wrong but not understanding what was happening. Ryan couldn't bring himself to look at the dog, knowing that if he did, his resolve would crumble. At the shelter, a kind-faced woman named Angela greeted them. She listened patiently as Ryan explained the situation, his voice cracking as he talked about Brutus's military service and their bond. "We'll take good care of him," Angela assured Ryan. "And we'll make sure he goes to a home that understands his background." The moment of goodbye was heart-wrenching. Brutus, finally realizing what was happening, whined and tried to follow Ryan as he turned to leave. The sound of Brutus's distressed barks echoed in Ryan's ears as he walked out of the shelter, each step feeling like a betrayal of the deepest kind. Back at home, the silence was deafening. Ryan locked himself in his room, ignoring his family's attempts to comfort him. The guilt was overwhelming, mixing with his PTSD symptoms to create a perfect storm of emotional turmoil. Days passed, and Ryan sank deeper into depression. He stopped going to his therapy appointments, stopped taking his medication, and rarely left his room. His family watched helplessly as he spiraled, unsure of how to reach him. Meanwhile, at the shelter, Brutus was struggling to adapt. Used to the structure and purpose of military life, the chaos and confinement of the shelter were deeply unsettling for him. He retreated to a corner of his kennel, barely responding to the staff's attempts to engage with him. Angela, who had taken a special interest in Brutus, spent extra time with him, trying to coax him out of his shell. "You're a hero, you know that," she would tell him, sitting patiently outside his kennel. "And heroes don't give up." Weeks turned into a month, and still, Brutus remained unadopted. His military background and the obvious signs of trauma made potential adopters hesitant. Angela began to worry that Brutus might be one of those dogs who would struggle to find a new home. One rainy evening, as Angela was doing her final rounds before closing the shelter for the night, she noticed something odd. Brutus, who had barely moved from his corner in weeks, was standing at the door of his kennel, alert and focused. His ears were perked up, and there was a new energy about him. Curious, Angela approached the kennel. "What is it, boy?" she asked softly. That's when she heard it, a faint scratching at the shelter's front door. Frowning, Angela made her way to the entrance, Brutus's eyes following her every move. When she opened the door, she gasped in surprise. There, soaking wet and shivering, stood Ryan. His eyes were red-rimmed, and he looked like he hadn't slept in days. "I made a mistake," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I need him back. We need each other." Angela's heart swelled with empathy. She had seen many animals surrendered over the years, but she had never seen an owner come back like this. Without a word, she led Ryan to Brutus's kennel. The reunion was immediate and powerful. As soon as Ryan appeared, Brutus let out a joyful bark, his tail wagging furiously. Ryan fell to his knees in front of the kennel, and Brutus pressed himself against the bars, trying to get as close to Ryan as possible. "I'm so sorry, buddy," Ryan sobbed, reaching through the bars to touch Brutus's fur. "I'm so sorry. I'll never leave you again." Angela watched the scene unfold, tears in her own eyes. She knew that the road ahead for Ryan and Brutus wouldn't be easy, but she also knew that together, they stood a fighting chance. As Ryan filled out the paperwork to reclaim Brutus, Angela offered some advice. "There are support groups for veterans and their service dogs," she said gently, "and trainers who specialize in working with dogs like Brutus. You don't have to do this alone." Ryan nodded, a glimmer of hope in his eyes for the first time in months. As they left the shelter, Brutus walking close by his side, Ryan felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, the strength to face another day. The journey back home was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet than the oppressive silence that had filled the car on their first trip to the shelter. This silence was one of understanding, of a bond reforged through trial and separation. As they pulled into the driveway of the Thompson home, Ryan took a deep breath. "Ready for a new mission, buddy?" he asked, looking down at Brutus. The dog looked back at him, his brown eyes full of unwavering loyalty and love. Together, they stepped out of the car and towards the house, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, this time, as an inseparable team once again. The weeks following Ryan and Brutus's reunion were filled with a mix of joy and challenges. Ryan, true to his word, threw himself into finding resources to help both himself and Brutus adjust to their new life together. He started attending a local veteran support group, where he found solace in sharing his experiences with others who truly understood. One crisp autumn evening, as Ryan and Brutus were returning from a therapy session, they decided to take a detour through Millbrook Central Park. The air was cool and filled with the scent of fallen leaves. Brutus trotted happily beside Ryan, his tail wagging as he took in the familiar smells of their hometown. As they rounded a bend in the path, Ryan noticed an elderly man sitting alone on a park bench. The man's weathered face and distant gaze struck a chord with Ryan. There was something in his posture, a weariness that seemed to go beyond physical tiredness, that Ryan recognized all too well. Brutus, sensing Ryan's interest, slowed his pace. The old man looked up as they approached, his eyes focusing first on Brutus, then on Ryan. A flicker of recognition passed over his face. "Evening," Ryan said, nodding politely. The old man nodded back. "Evening," he replied, his voice gravelly with age. "That's a fine dog you've got there." Ryan smiled, feeling a surge of pride. "Thanks. His name's Brutus." "Brutus," the old man repeated, a hint of a smile tugging at his lips. "A strong name for a strong dog. Mind if I say hello to him?" Ryan hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Go ahead, Brutus," he said softly, giving the command that allowed Brutus to approach strangers. Brutus stepped forward, his tail wagging slowly as he sniffed the old man's outstretched hand. The man's smile grew wider as he gently patted Brutus's head. "You've seen it too, haven't you?" the old man murmured, his eyes meeting Brutus's. There was an understanding in his gaze that made Ryan pause. "Excuse me?" Ryan asked, curiosity piqued. The old man looked up at Ryan, his eyes sharp despite his age. "The war," he said simply. "You can always tell. It leaves a mark, doesn't it?" Ryan felt a lump form in his throat. He nodded, unable to speak for a moment. "Name's Walter," the old man said, patting the bench beside him. "Care to sit for a spell?" Ryan hesitated for a moment, then took a seat. Brutus settled at his feet, his eyes moving between Ryan and Walter. "Vietnam," Walter said after a moment of silence. "That was my war. Different place, different time, but war all the same." Ryan nodded, feeling a strange mix of emotions. Here was someone who understood, truly understood, what he had been through. "Afghanistan," he said quietly. "Brutus and I, we served together." Walter's eyes lit up with understanding. "Ah, a team," he said, looking at Brutus with newfound respect. "That's special, that is. You two must have been through hell and back together." For the next hour, Ryan found himself opening up to Walter in a way he hadn't been able to with anyone else, not even his family or his therapist. There was something about Walter's quiet understanding, the way he listened without judgment, that made it easier for Ryan to talk about his experiences. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the park, Walter reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small paper bag. "Almost forgot my dinner," he chuckled, unwrapping a simple sandwich. He broke it in half, offering a piece to Ryan. "Not much, but I'd be honored if you'd share it with me." Ryan accepted the offered half, touched by the gesture. He broke off a small piece for Brutus, who took it gently from his hand. As they ate, Walter spoke about his own struggles after returning from Vietnam. He talked about the nightmares, the difficulty in adjusting to civilian life, the feeling of being adrift in a world that seemed to have moved on without him. "Lost everything after the war," Walter said, his voice tinged with old pain. "My marriage, my job, even my home for a while. Took me years to find my footing again." Ryan listened intently, recognizing much of his own struggle in Walter's words. "How did you do it?" he asked. "How did you find your way back?" Walter was quiet for a moment, his eyes distant. "One day at a time," he finally said. And I learned to find joy in the small things. A warm meal, a kind word, a beautiful sunset. It's the little acts of kindness, the moments of peace, that saved me in the end. As the last light faded from the sky, Ryan realized it was time to head home. He stood, feeling lighter than he had in months. Thank you, he said to Walter, meaning it with every fiber of his being. For sharing your story, and for listening to mine. Walter smiled, reaching out to pat Brutus one last time. Thank you for your service, both of you, he said. Remember, you're not alone in this fight. As Ryan and Brutus walked away, Ryan found himself reflecting on Walter's words. The encounter had been brief, but it had left a profound impact. For the first time in a long while, Ryan felt a glimmer of hope for the future. The next few days saw a subtle shift in Ryan's demeanor. He seemed more engaged, more present. His family noticed the change, exchanging hopeful glances when Ryan volunteered to help with dinner or suggested a family movie night. One evening, as Ryan sat on the porch with his sister Sarah, Brutus lounging at their feet, he opened up about his encounter with Walter. It's weird, Ryan said, absently scratching Brutus behind the ears. Meeting him, hearing his story, it made me realize that what I'm going through, it's not unique. Others have walked this path before me. Sarah listened quietly, giving her brother the space to express himself. I think I've been so focused on what I've lost, Ryan continued, that I forgot to appreciate what I still have. You guys, Brutus, this home. I've been taking it all for granted. Sarah reached out, squeezing her brother's hand. We're here for you, Ryan. Always have been, always will be. The conversation with Sarah marked another turning point for Ryan. He began to make more of an effort to engage with his family and his community. He started volunteering at the local VA hospital, finding purpose in helping other veterans navigate the challenges he himself was still grappling with. Brutus, ever attuned to Ryan's moods, seemed to flourish alongside his human partner. The dog's nightmares became less frequent, and he showed more of the playful, energetic side that had been suppressed by their shared trauma. As autumn gave way to winter, Ryan found himself once again at the park where he had met Walter. Snow blanketed the ground, transforming the familiar landscape into a winter wonderland. Brutus bounded ahead, leaving paw prints in the fresh snow. Ryan scanned the area, hoping to catch a glimpse of the old veteran, but the park was empty save for a few hardy joggers. As he turned to leave, something caught his eye. There, on the bench where he had sat with Walter, was a small envelope. Curious, Ryan approached. His name was written on the front in shaky handwriting. With Brutus watching attentively, Ryan opened the envelope and unfolded the letter inside. Dear Ryan, it began. I hope this letter finds you well. Our conversation has stayed with me, and I wanted to share a final thought with you. Remember that healing is not a straight line. There will be good days and bad days, steps forward and steps back. But as long as you keep moving, keep trying, you're on the right path. Take care of yourself and that noble companion of yours. With respect and understanding, Walter. Ryan read the letter twice, feeling a lump form in his throat. He looked down at Brutus, who gazed back at him with unwavering loyalty. What do you say, buddy? Ryan said softly. Ready for whatever comes next. Brutus let out a soft woof, his tail wagging in the snow. As they made their way home through the quiet, snow-covered streets of Millbrook, Ryan felt a sense of peace settle over him. The road ahead would not be easy, but he no longer felt alone on the journey. With Brutus by his side and the support of his family and newfound friends like Walter, he felt ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The bonds forged in the shadows of war and struggle had proven to be unbreakable. And in those bonds, Ryan found the strength to keep moving forward, one day at a time. As winter melted into spring, life in Millbrook settled into a new rhythm for Ryan and Brutus. The pair had become a familiar sight around town, often seen jogging along the river trail or volunteering at community events. Ryan's progress in therapy was slow but steady, and Brutus seemed to thrive in his role as both a service dog and a beloved companion. One warm Saturday afternoon in May, Ryan decided to take Brutus to the local farmers' market. The streets were bustling with activity, filled with the chatter of townsfolk and the aroma of fresh produce and baked goods. Brutus walked calmly beside Ryan, his training allowing him to navigate the crowded space with ease. As they made their way through the market, Ryan found himself enjoying the simple pleasure of being out in the community. He exchanged friendly nods with neighbors and stopped to chat with a few fellow veterans he'd met through his support group. Brutus, ever vigilant, stayed close to Ryan's side, his presence a comforting constant. They were nearing the end of the market when Ryan heard a commotion ahead. A woman's voice cut through the crowd, sharp with panic. "Stop! Thief!" Ryan's military instincts kicked in immediately. He scanned the area, quickly spotting a man pushing his way roughly through the crowd, a purse clutched tightly to his chest. Without thinking, Ryan started to move towards the thief, but the press of people around him made it difficult to navigate quickly. That's when Brutus took charge. The German shepherd's ears perked up at the sound of distress, and his body tensed, ready for action. Before Ryan could give a command, Brutus darted forward, weaving expertly through the startled marketgoers. "Brutus!" Ryan called out, struggling to keep up with his canine partner. He watched in a mixture of awe and concern as Brutus closed the distance between himself and the fleeing thief. The would-be robber, hearing the sound of Brutus's approaching paws, glanced back. His eyes widened in fear at the sight of the large dog bearing down on him. In his panic, he stumbled, losing his footing on the uneven pavement. Brutus, demonstrating the control and precision of his military training, didn't attack. Instead, he positioned himself between the fallen thief and his escape route, his posture intimidating but not aggressive. The man, faced with the imposing presence of the German shepherd, froze in place. By this time, Ryan had caught up, slightly out of breath but filled with pride at Brutus's actions. "Good boy, Brutus," he said softly, placing a hand on the dog's back. To the thief, he spoke with the authority of his military days, "Stay down and don't move." The crowd parted as a police officer, alerted by the commotion, arrived on the scene. Ryan quickly explained what had happened, and the officer moved to detain the thief, who offered no resistance, his eyes still fixed warily on Brutus. As the officer led the man away, a woman pushed through the gathered onlookers. She was in her early 30s, with dark hair pulled back in a messy ponytail and eyes wide with a mix of relief and lingering fear. "That's my purse," she said, her voice shaky. "I can't believe. Thank you. Both of you." Her gaze moved from Ryan to Brutus, who had relaxed his stance but remained alert. Ryan smiled, feeling a familiar surge of adrenaline fading. "We're just glad we could help, Are you all right?" The woman nodded, taking a deep breath to calm herself. "I'm Sarah," she introduced herself, reaching out to shake Ryan's hand. "Sarah Martinez. I don't know what I would have done if you and your amazing dog hadn't been here." "Ryan Thompson," he replied, shaking her hand. "And this is Brutus. He's the real hero here." Sarah knelt down, cautiously extending her hand to Brutus. The dog looked to Ryan for permission before allowing Sarah to pet him. "You're a brave boy, aren't you?" Sarah said softly, her fingers gently stroking Brutus's fur. As Sarah stood back up, Ryan noticed she was trembling slightly. The adrenaline crash was hitting her hard. "Why don't we sit down for a minute?" he suggested, gesturing to a nearby bench. "Give you a chance to catch your breath." Sarah nodded gratefully, and they moved to the bench. As they sat, with Brutus settling at their feet, a small crowd began to gather. People who had witnessed the incident were sharing the story, and soon, phones were out, snapping pictures of Brutus. "Looks like you two are going to be local celebrities," Sarah commented with a small laugh. Ryan shifted uncomfortably, not used to being the center of attention. Brutus, sensing his unease, pressed closer to Ryan's legs. Noticing Ryan's discomfort, Sarah quickly changed the subject. "So, have you two always been a team?" she asked, gesturing to Brutus. Ryan relaxed a bit, always more comfortable talking about Brutus than himself. "We served together in Afghanistan," he explained. Brutus was a military working dog. "Best partner I could have asked for." Sarah's eyes widened with understanding. "Oh, wow. That explains a lot. You must have been through so much together." Ryan nodded, absently scratching Brutus behind the ears. "We've had our share of adventures, good and bad. But we look out for each other, don't we, boy? As they continued to talk, Ryan found himself opening up to Sarah in a way he rarely did with strangers. There was something about her genuine interest and kind eyes that put him at ease. He told her about some of their experiences in Afghanistan, their struggles after returning home, and how they were slowly finding their place in civilian life. Sarah listened attentively, asking thoughtful questions and sharing bits of her own life in return. She was a teacher at the local elementary school, it turned out, with a passion for helping children overcome learning difficulties. As the excitement in the market began to die down and the crowd dispersed, Sarah glanced at her watch. "Oh, I should get going. I have papers to grade," she said, sounding reluctant to end the conversation. "But I'd love to hear more about you and Brutus sometime. Maybe over coffee?" Ryan felt a flutter of nervousness in his stomach, but also a spark of excitement he hadn't felt in a long time. "I'd like that," he said, surprised by how much he meant it. They exchanged numbers, and as Sarah walked away, Ryan felt a sense of possibility that had been missing from his life for too long. He looked down at Brutus, who gazed back at him with what seemed like a knowing look. "What do you think, buddy?" Ryan asked. "Ready for a new adventure?" Brutus's tail wagged in response, and together, they headed home, the events of the day having shifted something in both of them. Over the next few weeks, Ryan and Sarah met for coffee several times. Their conversations ranged from light-hearted discussions about their favorite books to more serious talks about their hopes and fears for the future. Brutus was always there, a comforting presence that seemed to bridge any awkward silences. As spring turned to summer, word of Brutus's heroic act at the farmers' market spread through Millbrook. The local newspaper ran a feature story on the duo, highlighting not just the incident at the market, but also their military service and their volunteer work in the community. The attention was overwhelming at times for Ryan, who still struggled with crowds and being in the spotlight. But he found that sharing Brutus's story, and by extension, his own, was unexpectedly therapeutic. It gave him a platform to talk about the challenges faced by veterans and the incredible work done by service dogs. One sunny afternoon, as Ryan and Brutus were leaving the VA hospital after a volunteer session, they were approached by a man in a suit. He introduced himself as Michael Dawson, the director of a non-profit organization that trained service dogs for veterans. "I've heard about the work you and Brutus have been doing," Michael said, his tone respectful. "We're always looking for ambassadors to help raise awareness about the benefits of service dogs for veterans. Would you be interested in working with us?" Ryan hesitated, feeling a mix of pride and apprehension. He looked down at Brutus, who sat calmly by his side, ever ready to take on a new mission. In that moment, Ryan realized that this could be an opportunity to give back, to help other veterans find the kind of support and companionship that Brutus had given him. "You know what?" Ryan said, a smile spreading across his face. "I think we would be honored to help." As they walked away, Ryan's mind was already spinning with possibilities. He thought about all the veterans he'd met who were struggling to find their place in the world, just as he had. He thought about the difference Brutus had made in his life, and how amazing it would be to help other veterans find that same bond. For the first time in a long time, Ryan felt like he had a true purpose. He and Brutus weren't just surviving anymore, they were thriving, and now they had the chance to help others do the same. As they reached Ryan's truck, he knelt down next to Brutus, looking into the dog's loyal brown eyes. "Well, buddy," he said softly, "looks like we're going to be heroes once more. What do you say? Ready for a new mission?" Brutus's tail wagged enthusiastically, and he gave a soft woof of agreement. Together, they climbed into the truck, ready to face whatever challenges and adventures lay ahead. They had come full circle, from war heroes to struggling survivors, and now to beacons of hope for others walking the same difficult path. As Ryan started the engine, he felt a sense of excitement and purpose that he hadn't experienced since his days in the military. But this time, it wasn't about fighting a war. It was about healing, about showing others that there was light at the end of the tunnel, no matter how dark things might seem. With Brutus by his side and a new mission ahead of them, Ryan drove home, feeling truly alive for the first time in years. Their journey was far from over, but now, it was filled with hope, purpose, and the promise of brighter days to come. The summer heat in Millbrook was in full swing as Ryan and Brutus settled into their new role as ambassadors for the Veteran Service Dog Program. Their days were filled with visits to VA hospitals, community events, and even a few local schools where they shared their story and raised awareness about the benefits of service dogs for veterans. Ryan found himself growing more comfortable with public speaking, drawing strength from Brutus's steady presence beside him. The German Shepherd seemed to have an innate sense of when Ryan needed support, pressing closer during moments of stress or anxiety. One particularly humid afternoon, Ryan and Brutus were scheduled to speak at a fundraiser for the local animal shelter. As they arrived at the venue, a converted barn on the outskirts of town, Ryan felt a flutter of nerves in his stomach. These events were still challenging for him, bringing back memories of crowded markets in Afghanistan and the constant vigilance required in a war zone. Brutus, sensing Ryan's unease, nudged his hand gently. Ryan looked down, meeting the dog's warm brown eyes. "Thanks, buddy," he murmured, taking a deep breath. "We've got this, right?" As they made their way inside, Ryan spotted a familiar face in the crowd. Sarah Martinez, the teacher he'd met at the farmer's market, was chatting with a group of volunteers near the refreshment table. She caught his eye and waved, excusing herself from her conversation to come greet them. "Ryan, Brutus, I'm so glad you could make it," Sarah said warmly, her eyes bright with genuine pleasure at seeing them. She knelt down to Brutus's level, offering her hand for him to sniff. "And how's my favorite hero doing today?" Ryan felt a warmth spread through his chest at Sarah's easy manner with Brutus. Over the past few weeks, they'd been spending more time together, and Ryan found himself looking forward to their coffee dates and long walks in the park. Sarah had a way of making him feel at ease, of helping him see the world as a place of possibility rather than threat. "We're doing great," Ryan replied, surprised to find that he meant it. "A little nervous about the speech, but Brutus here keeps me grounded." Sarah stood up, her hand briefly touching Ryan's arm in a gesture of support. "You'll do wonderfully," she assured him. "The work you're doing is so important. People need to hear your story." As the event began, Ryan took his place at the podium, Brutus a reassuring presence at his side. He began to speak, sharing their journey from the battlefields of Afghanistan to the streets of Millbrook. He talked about the challenges they'd faced, the dark times when he'd almost given up, and the unbreakable bond that had seen them through. As he spoke, Ryan could see the impact his words were having on the audience. There were nods of understanding from fellow veterans, tears in the eyes of family members, and looks of dawning comprehension from those who had never truly understood the struggles faced by those returning from war. Halfway through his speech, Ryan faltered for a moment, overwhelmed by emotion as he recounted the day he'd surrendered Brutus to the shelter. The memory, still painful, threatened to derail his composure. But then he felt it, Brutus's warm weight leaning against his leg, grounding him in the present. Ryan took a deep breath, drew strength from his loyal companion, and continued. As he concluded his speech, the barn erupted in applause. Ryan felt a mix of relief and pride wash over him. They'd done it, they'd shared their story, and it had resonated with people. As he stepped down from the podium, he was surrounded by well-wishers, each eager to share a word of thanks or to pet Brutus. Among the crowd, Ryan spotted a face he didn't recognize, an older man with salt and pepper hair and kind eyes. The man waited patiently until the crowd had thinned before approaching. "Mr. Thompson," the man said, extending his hand. "I'm Dr. Alan Foster. I'm a researcher at the University of Georgia, specializing in the effects of animal-assisted therapy on PTSD in veterans." Ryan shook Dr. Foster's hand, intrigued. "It's nice to meet you, Dr. Foster. What brings you to our little fundraiser in Millbrook?" Dr. Foster smiled warmly. "I've been following your story, actually. The work you and Brutus are doing is remarkable, and it aligns perfectly with my research. I was wondering if you might be interested in participating in a study we're conducting." Ryan felt a mix of surprise and hesitation. "A study? What kind of study?" "We're looking at the long-term effects of service dogs on veterans with PTSD," Dr. Foster explained. "It would involve some interviews, a few psychological assessments, and observations of you and Brutus together. The goal is to provide concrete data to support funding for more service dog programs for veterans." Ryan's mind raced with the possibilities. This could be a chance to make an even bigger difference, to help ensure that other veterans could benefit from the kind of support Brutus had given him. But it also meant opening up about some of the darkest periods of his life, reliving memories he'd worked hard to process. I'm not sure, Ryan said hesitantly. It sounds important, but take your time to think about it, Dr. Foster said kindly, handing Ryan a business card. Talk it over with your support system. We'd be honored to have you participate, but only if you're comfortable. As Dr. Foster moved away, Sarah approached, having overheard part of the conversation. That sounds like an amazing opportunity, Ryan, she said softly. But I understand why you're hesitant. Ryan nodded, grateful for her understanding. It's just, there's still so much I'm working through. The idea of putting it all under a microscope. Sarah reached out, taking his hand in hers. The gesture was so natural, so comforting, that Ryan felt some of his anxiety melt away. Whatever you decide, I'm here for you, she said. And I know Brutus is too. As if on cue, Brutus pressed against Ryan's leg, looking up at him with those soulful eyes. Ryan couldn't help but smile. What do you think, buddy? Ready to be a science experiment? Brutus's tail wagged, and he let out a soft woof that sounded almost like agreement. Over the next few days, Ryan found himself mulling over Dr. Foster's proposal. He discussed it with his therapist, who thought it could be a positive step in his healing journey. He talked it over with his family, who were supportive but concerned about the potential stress it might cause. But it was a conversation with Walter, the Vietnam veteran he'd met in the park months ago, that finally helped Ryan make his decision. They met for coffee at the local diner, Brutus curled up under the table at their feet. Ryan explained Dr. Foster's study and his reservations about participating. Walter listened thoughtfully, his weathered hands wrapped around his coffee mug. When Ryan finished, the older man was quiet for a moment before speaking. You know, son, Walter began, his voice gravelly with age and emotion, when I came back from Nam, there was nothing like this. No studies, no service dogs, hardly any support at all. We were just expected to suck it up and get on with life. He paused, taking a sip of his coffee before continuing. It took me years to find my way back to some kind of normal. If I'd had the kind of help you and Brutus are offering other vets, well, who knows how different things might have been. Ryan nodded, understanding the weight of Walter's words. It won't be easy, Walter continued. Digging up old wounds never is. But think of the good it could do. Think of the vets out there struggling like we did, who might get the help they need because of this study. As Ryan left the diner that evening, Brutus trotting faithfully by his side, he felt a sense of clarity he hadn't experienced in a long time. The pieces of his life, his bond with Brutus, his growing relationship with Sarah, his role as an ambassador for veteran service dogs, and now this opportunity to contribute to important research, were all coming together in a way he never could have imagined. The next morning, Ryan picked up the phone and dialed Dr. Foster's number. When the researcher answered, Ryan took a deep breath and said, Dr. Foster? It's Ryan Thompson. I've made my decision. Brutus and I would like to participate in your study. As he hung up the phone, Ryan felt a mixture of nervousness and excitement. He looked down at Brutus, who gazed back at him with unwavering trust and affection. Well, buddy, Ryan said, kneeling down to ruffle Brutus's fur, looks like we're starting a new chapter. Together, as always. Brutus responded with an enthusiastic tail wag and a soft bark, as if to say he was ready for whatever came next. And as Ryan scratched behind his faithful companion's ears, he realized that he was ready too. Ready to face the challenges ahead, to continue healing, and to help others find the same comfort and strength he'd found in his bond with Brutus. The pieces had come together, forming a picture of hope, purpose, and the enduring power of the connection between humans and dogs. It wasn't the life Ryan had envisioned for himself when he'd first enlisted, but as he stood there with Brutus by his side, he knew it was exactly where he was meant to be. The crisp autumn air carried the scent of fallen leaves as Ryan and Brutus made their way across the University of Georgia campus. It had been 6 months since they'd agreed to participate in Dr. Foster's study, and today marked their final session. Brutus trotted alongside Ryan, his demeanor calm but alert, ever attuned to his partner's needs. As they approached the psychology building, Ryan felt a mix of emotions. The past half-year had been challenging, forcing him to confront memories and feelings he'd long tried to bury. But it had also been incredibly rewarding. Through the process, he'd gained new insights into his own healing journey and the profound impact Brutus had on his life. Dr. Foster greeted them warmly as they entered his office. "Ryan, Brutus, good to see you both. How are you feeling today?" Ryan settled into the familiar armchair, Brutus lying at his feet. "Good, actually. A little nervous about wrapping everything up, but good." The session proceeded as usual, with Dr. Foster asking questions about Ryan's experiences over the past week, his interactions with Brutus, and any changes he'd noticed in his PTSD symptoms. As they talked, Ryan realized just how far he'd come since that day at the fundraiser when Dr. Foster had first approached him. "You know," Ryan said, pausing thoughtfully, "when we started this, I was worried about dredging up old pain. And yeah, it's been tough at times. But it's also helped me see how much progress I've made. How much Brutus has helped me make." Dr. Foster nodded, a small smile on his face. "That's been clear in our sessions, Ryan. The data we've collected, not just from you but from all our participants, is showing some really promising results about the long-term benefits of service dogs for veterans with PTSD." As the session wound down, Dr. Foster leaned forward, his expression serious but kind. "Ryan, I want to thank you for your participation in this study. Your openness and dedication have been invaluable. But I also have a proposition for you, if you're interested." Ryan raised an eyebrow, curious. "What kind of proposition?" "We're looking to expand our research, to start a more comprehensive program combining service dog training with veteran support services," Dr. Foster explained. "We need someone to help coordinate between the veterans, the dog trainers, and our research team. Someone who understands both sides of the equation. I think you'd be perfect for the role." Ryan sat back, stunned. "Me? But I'm not a researcher or a dog trainer." Dr. Foster smiled. "No, but you have something just as valuable: experience. You know firsthand what these veterans are going through, and you've seen the difference a dog like Brutus can make. Plus, the work you've been doing as an ambassador has shown you have a real talent for communication and advocacy." Ryan's mind raced with the possibilities. It would mean moving to Athens, starting a new career, taking on a whole new set of responsibilities. But it would also mean a chance to make a real difference, to help other veterans find the kind of healing and purpose he'd found with Brutus. "Can I think about it?" Ryan asked. "Discuss it with my family?" "Of course," Dr. Foster replied. "Take all the time you need. This would be a big change, and it's important that you're sure it's the right move for you." As Ryan and Brutus left the office, the campus was bathed in the golden light of late afternoon. They made their way to a quiet spot under a large oak tree, one of their favorite places to relax after sessions. Ryan sat on a bench, and Brutus settled at his feet, always vigilant but at ease. Ryan pulled out his phone, his finger hovering over Sarah's number. Over the past months, their relationship had deepened, evolving from friendship to something more. Sarah had been there through the ups and downs of the study, offering support, understanding, and often just a quiet presence when words weren't enough. He hit dial, and Sarah answered on the second ring. "Hey, you," she said warmly. "How'd it go today?" Ryan filled her in on the session and Dr. Foster's job offer. As he talked, he could hear the excitement creeping into his own voice. "Ryan, that's amazing," Sarah exclaimed when he finished. "It sounds like a perfect fit for you and Brutus. But it would mean leaving Millbrook, wouldn't it?" There was a note in her voice that made Ryan's heart skip a beat. "Yeah, it would," he said softly. "Sarah, I don't want to presume anything, but I was hoping, maybe you'd consider coming with us." "I know it's a lot to ask, but yes," Sarah interrupted, her voice firm and full of emotion. "Yes, I'll come with you. Ryan, what you and Brutus have together, the work you're doing, it's special. I want to be part of that, if you'll have me." Ryan felt a wave of emotion wash over him. He looked down at Brutus, who gazed back at him with those understanding brown eyes. "We'd love nothing more," he said, his voice thick with feeling. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity. Ryan accepted Dr. Foster's offer, and he and Sarah began the process of planning their move to Athens. There were moments of stress and uncertainty, but through it all, Brutus remained a steady, calming presence. On their last night in Millbrook, Ryan's family threw a small going-away party. As Ryan looked around at the faces of his loved ones, his parents, his sister, Walter, and the friends he'd made through his volunteer work, he felt a profound sense of gratitude. These were the people who had supported him through his darkest times, who had believed in him even when he couldn't believe in himself. Walter approached Ryan as the party was winding down, clapping him on the shoulder. "You've come a long way, son," the old veteran said, his eyes misty. "I'm proud of you. And I know you're going to do great things in Athens." Ryan swallowed the lump in his throat. "Thank you, Walter. For everything. I don't know if I'd be here without your guidance." Walter smiled, then knelt down to Brutus's level. "And you," he said to the dog, "keep taking good care of him, you hear?" Brutus woofed softly, as if making a promise. The morning of the move dawned bright and clear. Ryan, Sarah, and Brutus piled into Ryan's truck, which was loaded with their belongings. As they drove through Millbrook one last time, Ryan felt a mix of nostalgia and excitement for what lay ahead. They made one last stop before leaving town, the animal shelter where Ryan had once surrendered Brutus. But this visit wasn't tinged with sadness. Instead, Ryan and Sarah spent an hour talking with the staff, sharing their story and discussing ways they could collaborate in the future to help more veterans connect with rescue dogs. As they finally hit the highway, bound for their new life in Athens, Ryan glanced in the rearview mirror. Brutus was sitting up in the back seat, alert and ready for the journey ahead. Sarah sat beside Ryan, her hand resting comfortably on his knee. "Ready for our new mission, buddy?" Ryan asked, reaching back to scratch Brutus behind the ears. Brutus let out an enthusiastic bark, and Sarah laughed. "I think that's a yes," she said, her eyes sparkling with excitement and love. Ryan smiled, feeling a sense of peace and purpose he'd once thought was lost to him forever. As the miles rolled by, he reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. From the battlefields of Afghanistan to the quiet streets of Millbrook, from the depths of PTSD to the heights of recovery and renewal, it had been a long and often difficult road. But through it all, there had been Brutus, loyal, brave, and unwavering in his support. And now there was Sarah too, bringing a new kind of love and partnership into his life. As they crossed the state line into Georgia, the sun high in the sky, Ryan felt a surge of optimism for the future. He didn't know exactly what challenges lay ahead, but he knew he wouldn't face them alone. With Brutus by his side and Sarah by his side, he was ready for whatever came next. Their new mission was just beginning, but Ryan knew that together, they could accomplish anything. As the Athens city limits sign came into view, Ryan took a deep breath, feeling the excitement of new beginnings. "Well, guys," he said, glancing at Sarah and then back at Brutus, "looks like we're home." Brutus barked happily, and Sarah squeezed Ryan's hand. As they drove into their new city, ready to start their new life, Ryan knew that this was more than just a fresh start. It was the beginning of a new chapter in a story that had been years in the making, a story of resilience, healing, and the unbreakable bond between a man and his dog. Whatever the future held, they would face it together, Ryan, Brutus, and now Sarah, a family forged through adversity and bound by love, ready to make a difference in the lives of veterans and their loyal canine companions.